The biting cold of the winter night in Manhattan was not just temperature. It was a physical presence that seemed to hush the entire city. Snow fell in dense, silent curtains, transforming the opulent canyon of high-rises into something beautiful, yet desolate. Reuben B. Rowland, a striking figure in his late 30s. His dark, perfectly styled hair dusted lightly with white. His piercing blue-gray eyes narrowed against the wind, stepped away from the warm cocoon of his sleek black sedan. He was wearing an Italian cashmere coat that spoke of impregnable wealth and a mindset of absolute control, having just closed a difficult deal. He inhaled the frigid air, savoring the solitude, before walking the final few feet toward his private entrance. It was the lack of movement, the unnatural stillness, that caught his eye in the narrow, shadowed service alley adjacent to his building. Beneath the soft, silent downpour, a small mound of snow seemed to have taken an odd human shape against the brick wall. Reuben stopped dead. His breath, which had been fogging rhythmically, hitched. He approached, the expensive leather of his dress shoes crunching loudly in the unnerving quiet. It wasn't until he was mere feet away that he saw the figure clearly. A child, a girl no older than 10, Betty Flanagan, curled into a fetal position. Her thin, torn jacket was soaked through, and her bare hands were raw, clutching her knees in a desperate attempt to conserve the last heat. His perfectly constructed life of emotional detachment shattered like glass in the Arctic air. Reuben dropped to his knees in the drifts without a thought for his coat or suit. "Hey!" he said, his voice coming out as a strained, rough sound. He reached a hand out, his glove brushing her ice-cold cheek. "Can you hear me? You're freezing. We need to move." Her eyes fluttered open, large, glassy, and fighting a losing battle against unconsciousness. Her lips were a terrifying shade of blue. She didn't ask for water, or warmth, or a doctor. She looked at the handsome, powerful man hovering over her, and managed only a ragged, heartbreaking whisper. "Please don't leave me here," they said.
"Please don't leave me
They
here."
said no one
They
would
said-
come. The
they
sheer
said no
terror,
one would
the
come.
profound resignation in her plea, that her main fear wasn't death, but being left behind, left the powerful billionaire utterly speechless. In that instant, his rules, his distance, and the security of his empire meant nothing. He swiftly unclasped his own heavy coat and wrapped the struggling girl in the thick cashmere, before scooping her into his arms. He felt her terrifying lack of weight, the fragile warmth struggling against the relentless cold. "Driver! Now!" Reuben barked into his concealed earpiece, his voice cold and commanding, a tone his subordinates knew meant absolute urgency. He ran for the sedan, his heart pounding a violent, unfamiliar rhythm that had everything to do with the small, fragile stranger in his arms, and nothing to do with quarterly reports. "Drive to St. Jude's Emergency. Step on it. Call ahead. Tell them to prepare for severe hypothermia. Don't stop." The emergency room at St. Jude's was a brutal collision of fluorescent light and human panic, but to Reuben, it felt less chaotic than the alley he had just escaped. He ignored the shocked stares of the nurses as he burst through the double doors, his luxurious cashmere coat, Betty still wrapped tightly inside it, streaked with slush and dirt. He did not ask, he commanded. Within seconds, a trauma team had swarmed Betty, carefully peeling away the makeshift cocoon of his coat. Reuben stepped back, his expensive suit now a stark, alien uniform in the clinical severity of the room. He felt the terrifying, absolute loss of control he had spent a lifetime avoiding. A young resident, clipboard in hand, approached him, demanding legal information. "Sir, we need the child's guardian information and permission to start aggressive rewarming protocols." "Are you her father?" "I'm her guardian," Reuben lied smoothly, decisively. "Start the treatment. I take full financial and legal responsibility for everything. Anything she needs, you do it." He saw the resident hesitate, looking from his frantic urgency to his tailored elegance. Reuben cut him off with a chilling finality. Don't waste another second confirming my credit. Get to work. The lie was out, the line crossed. Reuben, the man who never acted without calculated precision, had just signed away his solitude with a single, desperate verbal contract. He was eventually directed to a cold, beige waiting area, where a woman with tired eyes and a professional lanyard introduced herself as Karen Mitchell, a social worker assigned to the case. She carried the quiet, heavy resignation of someone who saw too much, too often. She gave us your name, Mr. Rowland, and your building address, Karen said, her voice low. Betty Flanagan. She's in the foster care system, under the guardianship of Martha Cunningham. Reuben's eyes hardened. Cunningham? You mean the monster who left a child to freeze to death? Karen sighed, running a hand through her short hair. It's complicated, Mr. Rowland. Martha has a license. There have been complaints, ignored complaints. Budget cuts, overburdened caseloads, the whole failure is systemic. But the facts are this. Betty ran away this evening because Martha locked her outside. Reuben stared at her, the blood draining from his face. Locked her out? In this weather? As punishment? Yes, Karen confirmed softly. It was only supposed to be for 10 minutes, Martha claims. Betty just kept going until she collapsed. Karen looked directly into his troubled blue-gray eyes. Mr. Rowland, you may have saved her from the cold, but legally, she belongs to the system. And right now, the system says she belongs to Martha Cunningham. Reuben's knuckles were white as he clenched his fists. The thought of Betty, barely breathing, being returned to the cold, dark place she ran from, ignited a primitive, protective fury in him. Then we changed the system, he said, the old, ruthless billionaire fire finally returning. But this time it was burning for someone else. She is not going back. The tension in the waiting area was thick and silent, broken only by the rhythmic beep of monitors from the ICU. Reuben was pacing near the swinging doors when they burst open, announcing a new arrival. She was a woman in her late 40s, disheveled and frantic, pulling a stained, oversized coat tighter around her. The air immediately soured with the stale odor of cigarettes and cheap wine. This had to be Martha. Where is she? Where is my child? Martha Cunningham demanded, her voice loud and brittle, shattering the sterile quiet. She didn't look like a distraught mother. She looked like a landlord demanding overdue rent. Before Karen Mitchell could intercede, Reuben moved. He covered the distance in 2 measured, predatory strides, planting himself squarely in front of the woman. His physical presence, tall, imposing, and radiating an icy, controlled fury, stopped Martha mid-shout. Betty is receiving emergency care, Reuben said, his voice dropping to a dangerous, low pitch. Every word was sharp, edged with steel. She's not going anywhere with you, Martha scoffed, her gaze sliding over his expensive coat and then narrowing with resentment. And who the hell are you, fancy boy? You think your money makes you better than me? She's mine. The state says so. I'm her guardian, and I need her home. I've got forms to fill, and I need that check. Move. She tried to shove past him, her hand landing feebly on his chest. Reuben didn't move an inch. He was a barrier, absolute and unyielding. You lost the right to that title the moment you locked a 10-year-old in the freezing cold as punishment. The accusation made Martha's face twist into a mask of spite. It was only 10 minutes. Kids need discipline. You don't know anything about raising kids, Mr. Penthouse. You just found a little stray to feel good about yourself. Give her back. Now. The sheer callousness of her concern, not for the child, but for the lost check, snapped the last thread of Reuben's patience. He stepped closer, forcing her back. Get out of this hospital now, he ordered, his voice echoing the command he used to dismantle corporations. You will not see Betty again. The state may say she is yours for the moment, but that is about to change. Martha sputtered, threatened, and was finally escorted away by a security guard. Watching her retreat, Reuben felt a grim, absolute certainty settle in his chest. This was no longer just about saving a child from the cold. It was about protecting her from the system designed to fail her. He pulled his phone from his pocket, dialing his chief counsel, Thomas. Thomas, Reuben's voice was low and steady. I need you to halt everything you are doing. I need an emergency legal petition filed immediately for temporary guardianship. I don't care about the cost, the time, or the complexity. You have 24 hours to make me this girl's guardian. We are going to war. The drive to Martha Cunningham's address was short but agonizingly tense. Reuben was accompanied by Karen Mitchell and a plainclothes detective, Marcus, whom Thomas had assigned for the legal process. The foster home was a 2-story box on a dead-end street, a sharp contrast to the soaring architecture of Reuben's own building. It was not just poor, it was dead. As they approached the front door, the first thing Reuben noticed was the cold seeping through the walls. The house was structurally intact, yet it radiated an unnerving stillness. Detective Marcus used his key. The moment the door swung inward, a wave of stale air, unwashed laundry, and grease hit Reuben with a physical blow. The thermostat near the entryway read a punishing 55 degrees Fahrenheit. To save on the gas bill, Karen muttered, her face grim. Reuben stepped inside, his designer shoes navigating a floor strewn with food wrappers and half-eaten petrified cereal. The interior was chaos, but not the lively chaos of a busy family. This was the inert chaos of neglect. In one corner, 2 young boys sat listlessly on a thin, soiled mattress, staring at a blank television screen, their eyes dull and vacant. Karen and Marcus began interviewing the remaining children, quietly pulling them aside, but Reuben couldn't stop moving. He was compelled to find the space Betty had called home. He found it down a short, dark hallway. A small closet, maybe 3 feet deep, with no window, no light, and a door that clearly possessed a sturdy external lock. His breath caught in his throat. This wasn't a room. It was a cage. On the floor lay a single, threadbare blanket, Betty's entire world. He dropped to his knees, his hands trembling slightly, and ran his gloved fingers along the inside of the door frame. There, etched faintly into the wood, were multiple shallow scratch marks, uneven lines left by small fingers frantically trying to escape the dark. The image of Betty, tiny and terrified, clawing at the wood in a desperate attempt to rejoin the cold, brutal outside world rather than stay in her room, was a paralyzing, devastating punch to Reuben's gut. The magnitude of his emotional detachment, his previous belief that this was not his problem, felt monstrous. He stood up, the old, cold fury returning, but sharpened by pain and empathy. He looked at Karen, who was watching him with a pitying understanding. "She's never coming back here," Reuben said, his voice flat and hard. It was not a promise to Karen, or a declaration to the detective. It was a vow made to the frightened child he once was, reflected in the desperate marks on the inside of the closet door. Never. The investigation was over. The fight had just begun. The hospital room was kept warm, but the sterile air held a persistent chill. Outside, the day had reluctantly begun, casting a pale, weak light through the blinds. Reuben had spent the night in a hard plastic chair beside Betty's bed, unable to leave, even after the doctors stabilized her. He hadn't slept, but he felt more alert than he had in months. He was watching the slow, even rise and fall of her chest when her eyes finally opened. They focused on him, large and dark beneath the dusting of freckles, taking in the stranger in the crumpled suit. Her voice was thin, barely a rasp, but the question landed with devastating clarity. "Are you real, or am I still dreaming?" Reuben leaned forward, instinctively placing his hand over hers. He had spent his life dealing with harsh realities, yet this simple query felt like the most complex negotiation of his career. I'm real, he said, his voice softer than he'd heard it in years. And
Everything's
I'm
gonna
not
be okay.
leaving.
I'm here
A
with you.
solitary tear
Thank
escaped
you.
the corner
I'm
of her
scared.
eye, tracing a clean path through the dirt on her cheek. It was followed by another, and another, until her small face was awash in silent grief. Everyone leaves, she whispered, her voice tightening with the weight of her conviction. They always leave. The words echoed with a painful resonance that cut straight through the armor of his corporate persona. He saw the child he himself had been, the isolated, overlooked boy, staring back at him. It was a terrifying mirror. Reuben squeezed her hand, anchoring her and, strangely, himself. Not me, he promised, the vow feeling absolute and sacred. He didn't know how he would keep it or what it would cost him, but the choice was already made. Not this time, Betty. I've got you. The sheer relief in her eyes, the way her grip tentatively tightened on his hand, was a shock of pure, unadulterated human connection. It was terrifying, inconvenient, and necessary. In the quiet chaos of the hospital room, the billionaire, who had run from connection his entire life, found himself tied to this fragile stranger by a promise he knew he could never break. The hospital staff quickly confirmed what Karen had warned. Betty was medically stable, but without an immediate, approved placement, the next step was a group facility. Karen looked profoundly distressed as she explained the reality. Group homes are better than Martha's, Mr. Rowland, but they're still institutional. They're cold. They're a temporary fix, and Betty has already been failed by so many temporary fixes. There are no suitable emergency foster homes available tonight. Reuben listened, leaning against the pale green wall, his arms crossed tightly. He looked down at the hand he had shaken the previous night, the hand that had squeezed Betty's in a simple promise. He thought of the faint scratch marks on the inside of that closet door, the desperate plea, and the way her eyes clouded with the expectation of abandonment. He imagined that look of defeat returning if she were taken away now, placed with strangers in a sterile, loveless facility. In a move that defied decades of personal philosophy and corporate caution, a move that shocked Karen and even surprised the cold core of himself, Reuben straightened up. Then she's coming home with me,
Then she's
he
coming home
declared,
with me.
his voice firm and decisive. Karen blinked. Mr. Rowland, you can't just. I can, Reuben interrupted, cutting her off with the chilling certainty of a man who makes his own rules. I have a suitable residence. I have the resources for full-time support staff. I have legal counsel filing the emergency motion right now. Arrange it, Karen. Emergency kinship-like guardianship. I will sign whatever papers are necessary. I'm taking her home. Within 2 hours, the bureaucratic gears had grudgingly, but swiftly, turned under the relentless pressure of Reuben's legal team. He signed documents filled with terrifying legal jargon, accepting responsibility for the life and well-being of a child he had known for less than 18 hours. He was now officially Betty's temporary legal guardian. He drove her, quietly, back into the city, away from the emergency room and toward his sleek, modern penthouse. The apartment, a monument to his control and success, was a minimalist paradise of glass, polished marble, and uncomfortable silence. It had been meticulously designed to accommodate one person, Reuben, and his carefully engineered solitude. When they entered the climate-controlled foyer, Betty, wrapped in a fresh blanket, gasped softly. The space was enormous, cold, and utterly lacking in human warmth. It was a space that had never known a sticky fingerprint, a misplaced toy, or the sound of a child's voice. It was beautiful, sterile, and terrifyingly empty. Welcome home, Reuben thought with a strange twist in his stomach. The journey had just begun, and he realized the hardest part wasn't fighting the state. It was warming this cold house, and perhaps, his even colder heart. The door to the new room stood ajar. Reuben, shedding the tailored formality of his suit jacket and tie, leaned against the frame, watching the subtle transformation. This was the West Wing guest suite, once a study in sterile white and expensive, unlived in silence. Now it was a child's bedroom. The walls were a soft lavender, chosen by his assistant after Reuben dismissed 3 different shades of pale gray. A plush golden retriever sat propped against a stack of new books on the nightstand. The bed, low and safe, was dressed in a thick, warm lavender comforter that looked like a cloud. Betty stood in the center of the rug, a soft, deep pile that swallowed the sound of her small, bare feet, her gaze sweeping over the room. She wore the clean cotton pajamas Reuben had bought for her, her small frame still unervingly thin beneath the fabric. "This is the whole room?" she asked, her voice a breathy whisper, as if a normal speaking volume might shatter the illusion. Reuben pushed off the frame and walked 2 steps in. "It is. The bathroom through that door is yours. The closet is yours. Nothing in here has a lock." "Nothing," he emphasized softly. Betty moved slowly, touching the silky fabric of the comforter, then reaching out to trace the light from the moon-shaped nightlight plugged into the wall. Her face, usually guarded, softened into confusion. "But I don't understand," she said, turning to him, her hazel eyes wide. "Is this for me?" Reuben B. Roland, a man who commanded boardrooms and negotiated billion-dollar deals without flinching, found himself temporarily speechless. The simplicity and brokenness of her question, the sheer incomprehension that something soft, warm, and wholly dedicated to her comfort could exist, was staggering. "All of it, Betty," he said, his voice dropping to a low, steady rumble. "The light, the dog, the soft bed. Everything here is for you to feel safe and to feel a home. You are safe now. You are not going back." He knelt down, meeting her at eye level, his gaze earnest. "I promise you that. You deserve this." Hours later, the penthouse was quiet again, the Chicago skyline a silent, glittering backdrop to the new, fragile order within Reuben's walls. At 2:47 a.m., the quiet was ripped apart. A sound, raw and animal, tore through the thick silence. A muffled scream, followed by a frantic, rhythmic shaking of the new bed frame. Reuben burst into the room. Betty was tangled in the comforter, her small body arched, hands clawing at the air. She was sobbing, a high-pitched, desperate sound. Her eyes clamped shut, reliving a fear that Reuben couldn't see but could hear in every terrified gasp. Reuben didn't hesitate. He sat heavily on the edge of the mattress, the movement steady and grounding. He placed one large hand on her shoulder, the pressure firm but gentle, and used his other to free her from the twisted sheets. "Betty, Betty, open your eyes. You're here. You're with me. It's Reuben," he repeated, his voice the only sound he allowed to exist in the room. Her eyes snapped open, wild and unfocused, before finally landing on his face. She clung to his hand, her small grip surprisingly strong, shaking violently. "The cold, the dark closet. She's coming back for me," she wailed, fresh tears streaming. Reuben slid his arm around her, pulling her against his chest, her fragile weight a profound burden of responsibility. He felt the tremors that ran through her, knowing they were relics of the cold, the hunger, and the fear. He held her through the residual tremors, his own breath measured and slow, creating a steady rhythm for her to follow. He stayed like that, his tie long gone, his bespoke shirt rumpled, an empire builder reduced to a simple anchor in the middle of the night. "Listen to me, Betty," he whispered into her hair, repeating the words like a charm against the darkness. "I'm right here. I'm not leaving. I've got you. Promise. No one is coming in this door. You are safe. You are warm. You are loved." He sat there until the city's first sliver of gray light began to paint the windows, and Betty's breathing finally evened out, her small hand slack against his own. He looked down at her sleeping form, and the billionaire knew he would trade every cent he owned for this one, hard-won, quiet moment of peace. The air in the courtroom on the 23rd floor of the Daily Center was thick and artificially warm, a stark contrast to the blizzard outside and the chilling cold of the testimony within. Martha, Betty's former foster mother, sat at the defense table, leaning slightly toward her sharp-suited lawyer. She had traded her usual apathy for an Academy Award-worthy performance, dabbing her eyes with a tissue as she murmured to the court, claiming she did her best, with a meager stipend and limited system support. She painted herself as the victim of insufficient resources, not insufficient compassion. But the evidence spoke louder than her practiced sorrow. The judge, an imposing, white-haired woman named Justice Arrington, listened without expression as medical reports were read into the record. Documentation of severe malnutrition, scarring consistent with neglect, and the terrifying diagnosis of hypothermia from a prolonged time outdoors. Then came the devastating photos. The empty, peeling walls of the spare room, the threadbare blanket, and the single broken lock on the outside of the door. The hushed silence intensified when Betty, dressed in a borrowed blue dress, walked to the stand. She was dwarfed by the witness chair, her legs dangling far above the floor. With a clarity that cut through the legal formality, her small voice filled the room. She said I was too expensive to feed. Betty testified, looking straight ahead, not at Martha. She locked me out when I made her angry. I thought I was going to die out there, in the snow, until he found me. When it was Reuben's turn, he didn't rely on his lawyer. He simply stood, a towering figure who projected an unusual quiet authority. I don't have a history with the system, he began, his voice deep and steady. But I know what I see, and I see myself in her eyes. I know what it's like to be the child no one chooses. I was that child. I spent years trying to build a life so clean and controlled no one would ever need me, and no one would ever leave me. His gaze finally settled on Betty, who watched him with wide, trusting eyes. I'm choosing her, Reuben concluded, a raw, undeniable sincerity in his tone. Today and every day. The judge's voice, clear and final, cut through the dense silence of the courtroom. After summarizing the devastating evidence, Justice Arrington delivered the verdict. Permanent guardianship of the minor, Betty Flanagan, is hereby granted to Mr. Reuben B. Rowland. A quiet, shaky breath of relief escaped Reuben's lips, and he immediately tightened his grip on the little hand resting in his. The court, however, did not remain quiet for long. Martha, whose composure had been a brittle, expensive shield, shattered. She sprang up, knocking her chair backward with a clatter that echoed off the high ceilings. No, you can't do this. You can't take my money. She's mine, she shrieked, her face contorted in a blinding flash of pure, financial rage. Justice Arrington immediately ordered the woman to be removed. In the hallway outside, the tension was a physical presence. Reuben was guiding Betty toward the elevator, his large body a fortress between the child and the crowd of stunned spectators. They were steps away from freedom when Martha, fueled by a final, desperate surge of malice, broke through the security detail trying to escort her. She lunged, her features twisted with hate. You little liar, she spat, reaching out a clawed hand to seize Betty's arm. In a split second, Reuben reacted. He swung his large frame around, stepping squarely between Martha and Betty, absorbing the attack completely. He shielded the child with the full breadth of his body, his voice dropping to an icy, absolute command that silenced the noise in the marble hallway. You will never touch her again. The words were a verdict more terrifying than the judge's. Security guards swarmed, pinning Martha to the floor. Her enraged sobs turned to panicked, frantic pleas as she was formally read her rights and arrested for child endangerment, fraud against the state, and assault. Reuben didn't look back at the chaos. He simply turned to Betty, who was shaking violently, and gently pulled her into the safe, quiet harbor of his arms. It's done, he whispered into her hair. It's finally done. We're going home. Months softened the edges of Betty's fear. With the guardianship secure and Martha imprisoned, the immediate threat vanished, allowing a slow, stubborn process of healing to begin. Betty started therapy, slowly learning to articulate the darkness that haunted her, replacing the involuntary shudders with words. She enrolled in a small, private school, discovering the sheer, terrifying joy of having her own locker and a desk. Laughter, tentative at first, began to replace the long stretches of silence and curiosity. The inherent hunger of an 8-year-old gradually eclipsed the constant fear. Reuben, too, underwent a quiet transformation. The endless hours spent in court and the hospital had irrevocably changed his priorities. His empire still stood, but his attention now lay elsewhere. He established the Betty Foundation, a bold initiative fueled by his billions and his personal experience. Partnering with the sharp, deeply ethical CPS agent, Karen Mitchell, he focused the foundation's mandate, reforming foster care oversight, funding rapid response emergency placements that circumvented bureaucratic delays, and providing specialized trauma training for social workers. It was a cold, calculated business strategy applied to a humanitarian crisis, designed to fix the cracks he had seen Betty fall through. The story found its final, ordinary resolution on the penthouse balcony. The harsh concrete and glass of the luxury terrace now hosted a small, messy array of terracotta pots and canvas gardening boxes. Betty, wearing mismatched gardening gloves and a streak of soil on her cheek, was entirely absorbed in her work. She held up a single, impossibly bright yellow flower, its face tilted toward the late afternoon sun. "This one's a sunflower," she declared, her face glowing with effort and joy. "They mean new beginnings." Reuben walked over from the sliding glass door, the light catching the lines of genuine ease around his eyes, a look that had replaced the permanent tension he'd worn for decades. He wrapped his arm gently around her shoulders, his gaze sweeping over the vast, glittering expanse of the city he had conquered. That city and his high-rise had been his entire world. Now, his home was defined not by the view or the money, but by the small, vibrant chaos inside. The penthouse, once a monument to success and isolation, was filled with construction paper, a scattering of children's books, and the simple, profound sound of a little girl softly singing to her yellow flower. He had finally and completely come home.